Okay, so this is probably my fourth time trying this, and I think this one should work for me. So I have 15 minutes. Great. Okay, so I'm doing the date of the Exodus. Okay. Day of the Exodus, we got the late dates and the early dates. The early dates are obviously the biblical ones, and then the later ones are, we'll talk about those later. First I'll go into the biblical dates. So we'll start with, so you look at the Bible and you find out the dates that way. So Genesis 15:13 through 16, God said to Abraham, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Then, in the 4th generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." So obviously verse 13 there is where we concentrate that you will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. Now obviously they're talking about Egypt here, because that's when you were enslaved. That's what God's talking about. But it's not it's not really that simple when you consider the whole chronology and you look at the dates. So do we take it literally 400 years? And when does this oppression even start? When does this 400 years start? We might at first glance say that it starts when Jacob and his sons go to Egypt, Genesis 46. But we run into difficulty if we say that the 400 years started there, because Levi was Moses' great-grandfather, and Moses was 80 years old when the Exodus happened. Exodus 7 verse 7. Moses' grandfather was Kohath, and his father was Amram. Kohath died at age 133, and Amram died at age 137. So here, I'll write this stuff down here. Okay, so Amram died in 137. So there's no way that the 80 years starts when Jacob and his 70 descendants enter Jerusalem. Because if we add up Moses' 80 years when they left, you only get 350 years. So at the most, they would have been in Egypt 350 years. So, and that's if Kohath has Amram when he's 133, and Amram has Moses when he's 137. So, but then the Exodus 12:41 sheds light on the timeline. It says that after 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. This tells us that what God said to Abraham about the 400 years is a roundabout number. So also we consider what Paul says, the date of the 430 years starts during Abraham's lifetime. Because Paul says in Galatians 3:17 that the law came 430 years after Abraham. So traditional dating has usually taken the 430 years to start with the birth of Isaac. This gives us about 215 years actually in Egypt, splitting up the 430 years. Scripture says in Exodus 1 that the Israelites increased in numbers very greatly, and it's interesting that Moses points this out and makes a note of this. So obviously he's trying to emphasize that they really procreated a lot, and this is why the Egyptians put them in bondage. The other part of dating the Exodus in the traditional way is looking at 1 Kings 6:1, that in the 480th year after the Exodus, Solomon started building the temple. Now, with the whole 430-year thing, you have it's good to look at it from Abraham on up and kind of see the timeline here. Now, in finding the date of the Exodus, it's really the easiest thing, though, really is just to do this and find out when Solomon started building the temple, what year that was, then just add 480 to that number, then there you have the date. So when it is determined when this actually is dated, one simply adds 480 to that year. Gleason Archer cites a number of scholars, and he's from the 70s. He cites a number of scholars who date the beginning of the building of the temple to roughly 960. The one he picked is 966. So we'll say building of temple 960 roughly, and so all you have to do then is add 480 and you get 1440. And so the example of how they do this, for example, I looked at a guy named Teeley. He uses extra biblical evidence to date the reigns of the kings of Judah and Jerusalem. So that would be the traditional biblical view, would be in the 1400s there. Well, now you have the later daters, and I'll start by briefly talking about William F. Albright, who, from what I've seen, seems to be the most famous historically of the he came up with the 13th century Exodus conquest theory, dating this in the 1200s BC. He came up with this in the 1930s. Now there were 3 sites that were excavated. There was the Tel Beit Mersim, which he called Debir. And then there was the Beitan, which he called Bethel. And then there was Lachish. There was violent destruction dated to the end of the 13th century. The Debir and Bethel, in those areas, they found a rich late Bronze Age city, but then after that was a poor Iron Age culture. And Albright claimed that was Israel. So at that time there was Manamtna, who he claims would have been then the pharaoh at that time, because this is the 19th dynasty of Egypt, and he would have been the son of Ramses the second. And so this would have been dating around, the Exodus then for him would have been dating around 1220, the late 13th century then. So moving on then to the more modern scholars, just to talk about a couple of them. The later daters will point to issues mainly of the Egyptian dynasty, looking at the archaeological evidence, and that's basically what Albright did, and they'll still do that. They also find certain difficulties with the number of Israelites in Egypt, but this is as much of a problem with dating as it is with either historical accuracy or the meaning of the word Yelef, which is thousands. So there's 600,000 men, not including women, in Exodus 12:37 says that. And so the Yelef, which means thousand, can mean clans, and it could also mean military like soldiers. So so instead of saying 600,000, you use 600. If you just say 600 clans or something like that. Now, Hoffmeyer, who is a modern scholar, will say that 600,000 is just a ridiculous number, because then you have all the total amount of people, including the women and children, is then going to be about 2 million. And then he points out that there are 20,000 troops in Egypt, and they were spread out throughout Egypt. So, like you said, 600,000 would have been insanely ridiculous. It would have been impossible. Now, it is possible that they could have populated that much when we consider the amount of years. They would have. I read somewhere that it would have had to have been, according to the biblical traditional view, 215 years. Starting with 70 people, it would have had to have been like a 5% increase, which is really high. But again, Moses makes the point to say that they really increased greatly. So there's really it could have happened, and that's basically our best argument, and we have it in the Bible. So because when you look at the grammatical context there, it's not really, it doesn't make any sense to say otherwise than 600,000. But anyway, we'll move on to the dating, though. Kitchen points out that during the Old Kingdom, dynasties 3 through 6, and there were 30 total dynasties in Egypt, which was years 2686 through 2181. The Old Kingdom, in the Old Kingdom, slavery was not the same as it was during the New Kingdom, which is 1540 through 1170. In the Old Kingdom, slaves were usually brought for more domestic work. According to archaeological evidence, there's no trace that the Old Kingdom had slaves for building projects. And this is something, so then Kitchen is useful in this regard, because he responds to certain claims of critics who will say, "Oh, well, they didn't have slaves." Well, he says, "Yeah, sure. In that early kingdom, the Old Kingdom, they had domestic slaves." But Kitchen says that this changed in the New Kingdom, and the New Kingdom is 1540 through 1170. So that's significant, because it can either be 15. It can be as early as this and as late as this. So obviously Kitchen, then he's a later dater, so he's going to be looking at it in the early 13th century. It won't be late like Albright did. He's going to look at it more at around 1275, because he sees it that he talks about that he believes that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was most likely Ramses II, and he presents evidence that Ramses also had guys who were foremen, and the ways in which Ramses II ran things, Kitchen claims, is very similar to how Exodus describes them, especially in chapter 5, stuff like that. So he finds it very, very likely that Ramses was the Pharaoh, and if that's the case, then it's 13th century. So I'll continue to talk, to finish up real quick on how he supports this even more. Kitchen also discusses Ramses and Pithom store cities that the Pharaoh made the Israelites make. Ramses was used by 11 kings in the 19th and 20th dynasties, and so that name was used. The traditional view will usually say that based on the dynasties, the Pharaoh was Amenhotep II. His father was Thutmose III. Gleason which was 1501 to 1447. Gleason responds to the claims that there is no evidence of building projects going on during this time, responding that he erected 2 great granite obelisks in front of the temple. Kitchen points out that the Ramses actually built a city called Pi-Ramses, which is a domain of Ramses II. And he also points out that Pithom is universally recognized as standing for